Hi, I'm Alex, the developer of the game Moroi, and welcome back to episode 2 of my devlog, in which we're gonna talk about the next steps I took after I finished the inventory. So in this episode, I want to continue where I left off in episode 1, and here I'm doing kind of a checkup of all the things I had implemented up to that point. So we have the turning place, in which the character turns to face the cursor with his upper body, and only fully turns after the cursor moved around him more than 90 degrees. The control scheme is WASD plus mouse, and it was kind of complicated to set, but I was pretty happy with the result in the end. Then we have the inventory, which is working exactly as intended, with all the melee weapon heads working on all the handles and the accessories changing shape with regard to the weapon head. At this point I had not yet implemented damage modifiers for every part, and all the weapons do the same damage. On the character, the attack animations are chaining up in a 3 attack hit combo, which again I decided is good enough for the time being. This combo, the way to set it, and some of the character animations I took from the free Unreal Paragon library, which is a great learning tool, and I would strongly advise you to go and use it and learn from it. I also set the pitch of the swoosh sound of the melee weapon to be higher for the sword and lower for the hammer, which is something that I did dynamically. Unreal is very powerful, and you can use it in many ways to create what you want. You just need to imagine it, and you'll find that 99% of the time the engine and the blueprint system surely has a solution for it. After that, I created my standard enemy, and after I made him run and attack, I decided I wanted to build the wounds system. I made a new project for the scope of this test, and I first started by painting a color under the mouse cursor. This worked fine for the static meshes and wasn't hard to do, but for the life of me I couldn't do the same for the skeletal meshes. So I found a very cool plugin, link in the description, that actually allowed me to paint even on skeletal meshes. The final wound system I envisioned should have localized wounds, blood splashes, dripping blood, and finally an animated blood pool under the body. So first I created a flesh shader, and I used the basic alpha to show it per hit. My enemy shader consisted of 3 layers of materials, one being the enemy himself, the second the blood, just a simple red material with low roughness, and the third the flesh material. The cool part is actually the masking of each of these materials layers. As you'll see, for masking the base layer to reveal the flesh I used the simple slash mask, whereas for the blood I used an animated mask, which I grew by exposing a parameter and changing it dynamically with a timeline. The result is exactly what I wanted, and already I was feeling anxious seeing as my vision of the wound system is starting to take shape. This is not yet the final shader for the enemy, as I plan to add more volume and deepness to the wounds and even maybe a secondary skeletal mesh inside the enemies, exposing internal organs and muscle. But for now, I'm happy with the result, and I tend to work in a fashion of 80% done, and when polishing time comes I go back and finish the rest of the 20% left. To test it out, I spawned a couple of enemies and I used a simple move to location so that they can come and attack me. It was very satisfying seeing that the system was working and knowing that I can use this system from now on everywhere in my game, as it will automatically work for bullet wounds, bite marks, basically anything, and all I need to change is the mask of the wound. Next thing was adding the blood splash on hit, and for that I took a water splash from Paragon and modified it, so it looks like a blood splash. It's not the final version and I might change it more in the near future, but for now, I think it looks awesome. I simply spawned the blood splash particle system where the weapon's collision meets the enemy, and that's it. The effect is spectacular, and it really adds to the overall feeling I was going after. I forgot to mention that I was being this detailed about the wound system so early in the development process, because I consider it to be a key element for me that would contribute a lot and early to the feeling of the game that was just taking shape. Following up, I did a blood dripping particle effect. This is a simple emitter that gets spawned after an enemy gets enough damage, and it appears where a wound would be placed. I did not try to make it very complex, I just spawn some particles and then make them stick to the ground where they fall. The effect doesn't need to be complex, because the movement of the enemies takes care of the job. If you have enough enemies, the ground will start to look like a Jackson Pollock painting. Finally, the last thing I wanted for my wound system was the blood pool forming under the dead enemies. While a blood splash appearing would have been just enough, I tried to go the extra mile and make the blood stain actually grow in size and not just by scaling an image. For me, when I did this, I think it was a little more challenging than I thought, because shader blueprints are a totally different beast, and I would advise anyone starting to learn Unreal shaders to prepare for facing a hard task. They are not that friendly, and you have to take your time with them and really learn how they work. The first results I had with my blood pool were so-so, and they were forming, for example, from outside in instead of inside out. But as usual, practice makes perfect, and after a fair amount of trial and error and some tutorials on how the basics worked, I finally managed to get the blood pool forming. The result, while by far not as good as I wanted, was acceptable enough, and I will revisit it again when polishing time comes. So overall, this was my wound system broken down for you and the logic steps I took in achieving it. Creating it and working on this system taught me some important things. It made me better understand the way I like to work my way into solving a problem. I learned how to better break down problems. I also learned how much attention I should give to a detail and when to stop. And last but not least, one of the most important things. If you try to solve each step as best as you can, the whole system may turn out even better than you thought it would. All the elements I did until now, the inventory, the enemy design, the main character, the weapons, and the damage system, altogether were starting to hint towards a game world I haven't yet imagined, and they all started to create the game itself, giving it a life of its own. This feeling took me by surprise, and I have to say it's one of the most rewarding things you can get while developing a game. At this point, most of my doubts have disappeared, and I felt very sure about the journey ahead. One of the biggest problems a beginner indie dev has is, what game am I going to make? I had the same issue myself, of course, because on one hand I have always been a fan of Diablo and hack and slash games, and of classic RPGs as well, and on the other hand, I have always loved surrealism, horror, dark atmosphere, and mystery. So when I started doing this game, I decided to start with the things I was afraid of. As I said in the first part, it was the technical parts and the inventory and programming, and later go on with the things I was comfortable with, which is building graphics, atmosphere, weird characters, story, and so on. So until this point, I was starting to feel relieved that a big part of the technical stuff was done and the visual part was right around the corner. Again, the wound system and the animations were crucial for me because they represent the backbone of the hack and slash feeling I was after. And I think that at this point I had reached it. I'd also like to talk about my creative process. I always like to start with an empty sheet of paper or a new file in Photoshop and sketch away my ideas from there on. I never like to get direct inspiration from other places while creating the art for the game. I do that because I find the process to be very personal, challenging, and probably the most rewarding. While I feel it is close to impossible to create something that's never been done before, I believe that being personal and creating your own concepts based on your own visions sparks the most creativity and artistic freedom, and may give the best results in the end. Regarding the world and the story, ever since I started developing this project, I always talked with friends and thought about all sorts of small cool stories that could happen in this game, and I wrote them down. Of course, they weren't related between them, but this sort of brainstorming did the trick in establishing the boundaries I could create within. I also am a big fan of folklore and fairy tales, and this is yet another place in where I found ideas. Lastly, many times I just take long walks and think about stories, how to fit them together, and how to blend them into the game world. So after I had a basis for the story, a solid concept for the first level, some enemies, and the means to kill them, I finally started doing the graphics, and damn was I hyped. First time I worked on the graphics for the level, laying it down and arranging the lights, I was so happy to finally see the world I had envisioned for so long taking shape that I did not sleep at all that night. Just putting floor tiles and decals and particles and lights, it was almost magical. One problem in general regarding the graphics, at least for me, is not knowing when to stop quote-unquote improving it. Also, another important issue is thinking the graphics I just did are the best I can do at that moment. So balancing these two problems is very important. When I did the level you see now, I was loving the graphics. I thought they looked very good. Now, looking at these old graphics and comparing them to how the game looks now, I think they suck. So in time, I upgraded the graphics of this area twice, and I found that I'm finally happy with the look of it. I will use this level of detail that I am now at to create the rest of the game based on. I found that this approach was very to my liking, as it will serve me as a guide and a safety net for the rest of my game. So that's been the second episode of my devlog. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something out of it, and if you haven't seen it yet, check out the first episode in the devlog. Thank you for watching, please like and subscribe, check out the links in the description to my other social media, you can also join my Discord for updates on the game and more, and see you in the next one.